and get us started. So first off, I'm Kara Cookston. If you don't know me, I coordinate the victim witness advocates. I'm based in the Attorney General's office. And this is our third day now of lunchtime chats to celebrate National Crime Victim Rights Week. And this year's theme is access, equity, and justice. And part of what we're doing is we're looking at both sort of how far victim survivor services in Maine have come, and sort of what's growing for the future, so that we can continue to fulfill this goal of serving all Mainers wherever they are. And so who better to invite today than Francine Garland Stark, who has worked in the movement to end gender-based violence for a very long time, and can share with us the history and the future of domestic violence services here. She's the executive director of the Maine Coalition to End Domestic Violence, and I will turn it over to her.
Thank you, Kara. And I am so delighted to be invited to do this today. And it's been an interesting exercise over the last couple of days trying to put this presentation together, because I realized, oh my gosh, it's been 50 years. There's a lot. So I've been trying to pick and choose what it is that I could focus on and say. And I just want to start by saying that there's a lot I don't know. I only know what I've had the opportunity to hear about, the pieces of this that I lived through. I came into this movement in 1985 as a volunteer, and I've been doing this work in Maine since 1986. And everyone here who is a survivor, who has worked in a different organization, has their own experience of this history and things to contribute to it. And so I'm sure that I'm going to forget to say some things and thank some people who need to be mentioned and thanked. And so I ask for your grace around anything I have left out. I swear it's an active omission, not an intentional omission. And so with that, I think what I'm going to do is share my screen. I do have a bunch of slides I'm going to try to go through quickly. And I hope that as I'm talking, you'll put questions and comments in the chat. And when I'm done with my show, I'll just stop sharing my screen so we can have a bit of a conversation, if that works for everybody. So here I go. Let me see how quickly I can share this up. It's working? Perfect. All right. So in the 1970s, we have some information about the roots of the movement, really thanks to a program that was created out of the Women in the Curriculum folks at the University of Maine. In 1993, they had a gathering of the founders of what was then Spruce Run, now Partners for Peace. And they created a readers theater program called The Somebody Else Was Us. And so we have, throughout my presentation, I've used a few quotations from that extraordinary resource. And if you want to read the whole thing, you can go to the Partners for Peace website. It's a really wonderful treasure we have about the origin story of Spruce Run. And so this, I think, is a perfect place to start. This was the time, the wonderful early 70s, when people were organizing around all sorts of problems. It was the war on poverty, and we were going to win it. And we were going to solve all these problems and change the world. That was Kay Lucas. Kay Lucas had a big house in Bangor, and it was the place people were organizing, the Bangor Tenants Union and the food co-op. Anything people needed to get together and talk about, that's what they did, and they wound up at their house. It was a women's center for a while, and as Lou Chamberlain, who was the first executive director of Spruce Run, said, it was where Spruce Run was born. It was the real center of activity for all these community services. including anti-war activities in the Bangor area. It was the way station for guys going up into Canada. Because you remember in the early 70s, that was when the Vietnam War was in its last years, and there was tremendous disruption across the country. And there were lots of people organizing and lots of people raising awareness, and women's groups were gathering, and change was in the air. And that's where Spruce Run really took form, because in telling our stories to one another, it kept coming up that we'd always dreamed of a place where we could go just for some respite, and maybe to be able to talk to people about some of the things we were feeling, and maybe take the children, just someplace to escape to for a while. And that was the form. That was the idea at first, that it would be wonderful to have a place to go to. And so that's what they created. Kay was herself a survivor of domestic abuse and violence. And really, it was from her divorce settlement that they got the money for the incorporation papers for Spruce Run. And Spruce Run was established in Bangor in 1973. It was the first in the state of Maine and just the third in the whole country. And so the early 70s really were the beginning of this very intensive organizing that was happening. And as Lou Chamberlain so well said, nobody wanted to deal with this issue of abuse. It was always somebody else's problem, but there was no somebody else. I mean, that somebody else was us. And so the us was happening all over Maine and all over the country. And so by the end of the 70s, there are several programs across the state. In fact, 1977, which is in fact the year I graduated from high school, there were a bunch of organizations across the state, and they all came together under the leadership of Nancy Gentile, who at that point was the director of Spruce Run, and created our coalition, which at that time was called the Maine Coalition for Family Crisis Services. And the coalition had no staff. All the work that was accomplished by the coalition was accomplished by the people who worked for those entities. And mostly they were entities that were all volunteer, with maybe an executive director, maybe one other person. They were really small shoestring entities. And as it continued into the next years, in the early 80s, we got the additional organizations founded to cover the rest of the state. Only Next Step Domestic Violence Project came along much later in 93, when they were an organization that really was born out of Spruce Run. It was a peaceful and pleasant split off from Spruce Run to establish services unique to Hancock County. And then the organization Womankind that had been serving Washington County out of Machias folded, and in a few years, Washington County was added to Next Step's catchment area. And so this is really what these organizations were created. 24-hour access through the hotline was really the key service. What we wanted to be sure people had was a safe place they could call to do the things that Kay Lucas was talking about. Have a place where they could connect with others, where they could feel safe, be supported, be informed, inform each other. And during those years, throughout the 80s, we were really just trying to create relationships and raise awareness. It was so common to hear on the hotline in the 80s and into the 90s that survivors were really feeling so isolated because they didn't think there was anybody they could talk to about what was happening to them. When they tried to talk to their families, a very common thing people were hearing was, "You made your bed, now lie in it." And I remember at one point, sometime in the late 80s, actually realizing, I haven't heard anybody say that in a while. It was such a common thing to hear. And a common conversation that we would be having with people was, whether or not there was anybody in their family or in their circle of friends that they thought might possibly be willing to have a conversation with them so that they could have support from somewhere. But people called us because we were the safe place to be able to tell about what was happening. And there were so many survivors who were generous in telling their stories. I was thinking about the names. I think about these women, Cheryl and Florence and Grace and Frida and Valerie and Claudia. And there were just so many who would tell their stories at speakouts, who would come with me, with other people who were doing training in order to tell their stories so that anybody in the audience, civic groups, professional groups, law enforcement officers, everywhere we went, survivors came, told their stories so that people would really have to see that these are real human beings having real life experiences, and it's on all of us to do something about this. And I've listed some of those initial partners because we didn't do any of this stuff alone. It was always done in collaboration. There were always people working with us as allies, providing us with referrals, providing us with money, providing us with staff. The University of Maine, University of Southern Maine, all of these entities were sending, volunteers for boards, volunteers for the hotlines, interns, all kinds of things. It was a broad community effort. In 1978, the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence was founded and continues to be a really vital voice of the collection of folks who are really doing the frontline work across the country. In 1979, the Maine state legislature allocated the first state dollars to support this work statewide. It was $142,000. It's about $20,000 each for the existing programs at that time. In 1980, was when the legislature enacted the laws that changed everything. The Protection from Abuse Order statute and the law that required law enforcement to treat people breaking the law inside their homes the same as if they were breaking those laws on the street. And what we had to do going forward was figure out how to make all of that actually real. And one of the important pieces of that was that in 1983, there was a really notorious crime that was committed. Fortunately, Tracy Thurman survived, but what happened was that she was trying to use the protection from abuse order process and calling out to law enforcement to protect her from her very abusive, very violent husband. And they didn't. And eventually there was this incident in which he stabbed her 13 times, and the police took their time showing up to the incident. And even when they got there, they didn't intervene to prevent him from continuing to kick her and abuse her. And so fortunately, she survived and she sued the police department and won a really huge settlement. And that provided a particular level of inspiration to law enforcement across the country to begin to take this new law seriously. And at the same time, it was really interesting because when I started doing training work in the 90s, Don Winslow at that time was the chief lieutenant at the Bangor Police Department. And he told the story that at almost exactly the same time as the Tracy Thurman incident happened, there was a woman named Cheryl Chase in Bangor who had called the Bangor police for help. And when they arrived, her abusive husband met them at the door and said everything was fine. And so they left, but they got a subsequent call about 20 minutes later and arrived to find her having been stabbed several times and on the lawn. And Cheryl also survived that attack. And while she didn't sue the Bangor Police Department, what happened was that Don Winslow, who went on to be the chief, really was part of the work happening to say, look, we've got to do better in terms of our response to these crises. We've got to make sure. And so there came from these realizations that there had to be practices developed. We need to have best practices for police departments to inform how they approached their investigations and how we gathered evidence and how we kept the victims safe. And so Maine, along with the rest of the country, really tried to examine what that intervention ought to look like. And there were great improvements that happened. But as with everything in this movement, it seems like every major step forward has been the result of some horrific act of violence. There were lots of people writing books. Prior to the 80s, there was hardly anything. It was really, if you didn't meet somebody who'd been through this or somebody doing this work, it's hard to really be able to find reference points. And but in the 80s, we started to get more material, and there were lots of really thoughtful people doing really thoughtful work. And really, it was focused on what survivors had been saying, just like the founders. What we really want is a way to be able to be safe. We want the abuse to stop. We want help with the abuse stopping. It's not necessarily that we want to have this person who's causing all this harm locked up forever and ever. We care about them, they're a real human being, but we want them to stop. And so the protection from abuse order was a way of saying, look, whatever you need to do to stop what you're doing, you need to do that. I'm not charging you with any kind of crime, but you need to not bother me anymore. You need to leave me alone. You need to leave the kids alone. You can't live here anymore. And if you do, somebody will arrest you, but really, I'm just giving you the opportunity to change the way you behave. And that was really powerful and important because most survivors didn't want to engage the criminal justice system. They wanted the abuse to stop. And they wanted the abusive person to change their behavior because they cared about them, and that's not, and wanted to be able to have the family sustain, children to have their father, all those kinds of things. And so what people were trying to research and trying to create was how to turn that wisdom into the way we delivered service, the way that we constructed interventions. Susan Schechter famously articulated this problem to say, this is something that is socially constructed. We have a social structure that somehow privileges the rights of men over the rights of others, particularly their families, particularly their partners and their children. And it's individually chosen. So as long as we keep trying to end this by taking it one abusive person at a time or saving one survivor at a time, we're never going to end it because we've got to unpack the social construction that allows us this to continue, that feeds the belief systems that allow this to happen. And so on the one hand, we're trying to figure out how do we change that social construction, and at the same time, how do we reach these individual people who are committing these acts of violence and convince them to change? And how do we connect with each of these survivors to help them feel like they have permission to center their own selves, their safety, and their futures, rather than having to continually be focused on just surviving each day after the other? How do we journey with each of these individuals, making no assumptions about what's going to work or be safe for them? So that was the work we were trying to do. And these are some of the books and some of the incredibly visionary things that were happening at that time that we reached out to. At around the same time that I joined the movement, it was really when the federal government was finally starting to lean in. The Family Violence Prevention Services Act was the first federal law related to domestic violence. It started sending some funding to the state that was incorporated into the contract along with the state funds to help support this work, as was the Victims of Crime Act. But really, throughout the 80s and 90s, the amount of VOCA funds, which is what the Victims of Crime Act was called, was something like 80,000 statewide for this work, which was very minimal. But it was very important because we also were able to get funding to help support the specialized victim advocates who were for people who were survivors of domestic violence. And we saw a small increase in state funds for domestic violence services at that time. And also Maine Housing started becoming an important part of the funding picture. They had been important in helping the organizations get what were called forgivable loans to purchase the old houses, many of which are still the shelters around the state. When I was the director of Hope and Justice Project in the 2009 to 15, I was part of being there when we actually paid off one of those 30-year forgivable loans. And so they were important, and starting in 1989, they were also part of helping fund the operations of those shelters, and there was some federal funding that started coming through as well. The 90s were really difficult. On the one hand, there were lots of promising things that were coming to fruition. The Governor's Commission was started. The National Network to End Domestic Violence was founded, which is the network of all the statewide coalitions. Our own coalition had really gelled. We had a full membership. We created our quality assurance standards. I went to this conference in Chicago where they unveiled national model policies for how states could best respond. And we started using the phrase, the coordinated community response. There was this watershed conference in Bethel that with all the judges in the state of Maine came together. We brought up Sarah Buell, who is still does extraordinary teaching work across the country. She's a survivor who went to Harvard Law School, and she has an extraordinary ability to help people see what the barriers are to survivors being able to escape this sort of trap of abuse in which they find themselves. It was an extraordinary time. But at the same time, what happened in the 90s was the Clinton administration and welfare reform and the fruition of the Reagan administration's cuts to housing subsidies. And so what we were looking at was a time with lots of opportunity in terms of this sort of systemic work we were doing. But what survivors were facing on the ground was the looming possibility of time limits on any public benefits that they were getting, work requirements, child support enforcement being tied to their getting public benefits. And we have tremendous debt of gratitude to the Maine Equal Justice Partners for their work in saving that whole system and helping ensure that the Department of Health and Human Services actually participated in making sure that workers understood what good cause exemption meant so that survivors could get an exemption from having their abusive partners pursued for child support when it was going to increase the danger that those families were in. It was also a time when they had welfare to work programs, and those were right full of survivors. And so, for example, in the Bangor area, we were invited to come do workshops and training for people who were enrolled in that program, which was really just doing outreach to survivors. And it was a really dynamic opportunity with, was then the TDC was the organization doing that at the time with us. And it's when Spruce Run got to hire Rebecca Hobbs back in the day, because we also started doing outreach at the TANF offices all around the state to try to reach out to survivors who were coming in for the newly required kinds of visits to the office of the Department of Health and Human Services. The other thing that was happening around these times is that Nicole Brown Simpson was murdered, and that trial was the first big televised event that created all sorts of awareness raising and outrage. And people created these buttons that said, "Remember Nicole," because everybody kept talking about OJ as if somehow OJ had created this awareness raising and change that was happening on the ground. And people wanted to remember, no, see, was really about the fact that Nicole has lost her life. And as a result, we're all becoming really aware and really determined to try to make change. And that happened right around the same time as the Violence Against Women Act, which, in addition to creating grant streams, made it so that all the protection from abuse orders issued in each individual state had full faith and credit enforcement in all other states. This was huge. And it also created some prohibitions for certain domestic violence offenders from possessing guns. And it expanded and enforced the requirements that all of advocates doing this work and being funded under the Act would keep confidential the identities and identifying information of everyone that we serve, and really prescribed the shape that those releases of information would have to have in order for us to ever be able to share any information. It was a very important and powerful support for our work. This was when we were creating certification standards for intervention programs, and the Domestic Abuse Homicide Review Panel was founded. And I hope that people read the report, because this last one that we did that came out in 21 really did a 20-year look back at all the cases that had been reviewed and some of the consistent learnings that we have from that work that are informing today what it is we'll be doing moving forward. There's been a lot of progress made in the justice system, for sure. There's a lot more to do, but I think what we've come to realize is that in many ways, what we've accomplished in our longstanding partnership with the legal system is that we have the structure in place to do what that system can do, and that our focus needs to be on continuing to try to help that system work as well as it can, but to try to broaden and deepen our effectiveness beyond that system to really attend to the safety needs of survivors outside of the criminal legal system, but to continue to support all of the gains that we've made to date. In the 90s and coming into the 2000s, one of the most important publications was the book, Safety Planning with Battered Women, Complex Lives and Difficult Choices. Any of you who have sat through training that I've done, and anybody else from our network has probably done the risk assessment exercise where we draw this little T-bar and say, what's a person at risk for if they stay in a relationship with someone who abuses them? And you make this long list of risks. And then you recognize that even if they leave, all these things that they're at risk for experiencing continue to be true. And in fact, most of them increase in likelihood, and they're more likely to be killed, and they're more likely to suffer additional troubles around poverty and access and all of the things that are problematic based on who they are and what their particular identity is. And so what Jill Davies and Eleanor Lyon did was try to write a book about how is it that advocates can really help survivors deeply explore what those risks are for them and how there can be any planning to mitigate the possibility that if they do in fact manage to get away from this person who's abusive to them, they can also be safe. And so that really helped to shape our work, and it's also shaped how it is that we engage with other systems and training to try to help them understand that really abusive men are so skilled at transferring responsibility for what they do onto the victim. And we as a society continue to put pressure on victims to leave as if it were a solution, and it's not. Unless we can really create the opportunity for a person to actually be safe, to have that space to connect and center themselves and their safety, we haven't done our work. There were lots of good things that we were able to accomplish through competitive grants available through VAWA. We were able to do some expansion of civil legal services. We created transitional housing programs. There were pilot programs in hospitals and child welfare that led to additional work. You heard from Donna Brown earlier this week, but Jane Root wrote the first tribal program grant at the end of the 90s to start the Maliseet Domestic and Sexual Violence Advocacy Center. The national hotline was funded out of VAWA. So we were able to, it was actually Polly Campbell, who at the time was working at Muskie, who wrote the first VAWA grant in Maine, and it funded the sort of pilot of having co-located advocates from domestic violence resource centers be at the major hospitals in Maine and at the child welfare offices. We eventually lost the funding related to that hospital work, but we were able to get a new grant starting in 2006 and have a strong partnership with DHS in sustaining that domestic violence child protective liaison program, which has done great work now for decades. VAWA helped us create the Somerset House. This was a family violence project initiative, creating the first shelter in Maine that's specifically structured to support survivors who are both escaping domestic violence and trying to cope with their own substance use disorder. That model informed really how all of our shelters are currently structured and staffed, because over the course of the 2000s, the extraordinary increase in substance use disorder troubles across our state have made it so that all of our shelters have to be attending to these things at the same time. That was not really true in the 80s and 90s, the way that it is today. We were able to get VAWA grants in order to support extensive rural outreach all the way from the Western Mountains up to the St. John Valley and out to Eastport. Doing rural outreach has been a priority since the beginning of this movement in Maine, and VAWA gave us some additional dollars to be able to support advocates to be in all those places. It's helped do outreach on campuses with youth. It's created elder abuse services, established a shelter for elders in Cumberland County. It's supported the expansion of all the services for Maine's tribes and the Wabanaki Women's Coalition. And the culturally specific funding stream has been helpful in supporting the Immigrant Resource Center of Maine. VAWA has been a really important component of our movement's survival. As I said, we've done collaboration since the very beginning. These are just a few that stand out because they've been there since the beginning and they continue to be so strong. Pine Tree Legal was, if you will, the original collaborator. Lou Chamberlain, when she was part of creating Spruce Run, was working for Pine Tree as a 19-year-old intern. The Maine Criminal Justice Academy has always stepped up, has expanded the number of hours in domestic violence training, has created best practices, incorporated accountability related to people's history of committing domestic violence crimes into their certification standards. They've been a really key partner. Maine Housing and HUD, we have new resources to help support people in housing that we couldn't have imagined 30 years ago. Bay Lupi and the Violence Intervention Partnership in Cumberland County has been a key partner in this work, a really important voice in how the shaping of the justice system's response to domestic abuse and violence, particularly around risk assessment and the coordinated community response. The Muskie School for a long time was a very close partner with the Department of Health and Human Services, and there were two initiatives that came out of that that had huge statewide implications. The cross-disciplinary training initiative that brought together professionals in domestic violence, substance use, and child abuse in order to understand each other better across discipline and provide collaborative training for the community, including one that I worked on co-authoring with the Reverend Dr. Marvin Ellison for clergy. The Victim Assistance Academy We did for 10 years for the Victim Witness Advocates in Maine and New Hampshire, as well as an advanced academy for advocates that included the state of Vermont as well. Under the Baldacci administration, we saw a tremendous advancement in understanding domestic violence in the workplace, and a collaboration across our state provided training and consultation for all Maine state agencies to have policies related to this, and training for all state employees. We reached 14,000 people over the course of, I think it was 2 years. It was a tremendous effort. And one of the more recent collaborations between who was then Attorney General Mills, the Department of Health and Human Services and Maine Housing, we were able to establish the first emergency shelter for trafficking survivors in Maine, in Androscoggin County, that MCEDV owns, and the shelter is operated by Safe Voices. A few more notes about the money. In 2000, we were going to see the first significant increase statewide, but in the first half of the millennium, we experienced 9/11. And so we only saw half of the increase that we won statewide for both sexual assault and domestic violence. And in spite of Governor King calling domestic violence public enemy #1, it was not until 2019 that we actually saw additional substantive state funds invested in this work. And in fact, in 2008, there was a proposal to cut all state funds from this work. And I just said there were busloads, because in fact, we showed up literally in busloads, and that did not win. There has been a lot of change over time. As I said, the original name of our coalition was the Maine Coalition for Family Crisis Services, but now, of course, we're the Maine Coalition to End Domestic Violence. Battered Women's Project is now Hope and Justice Project. Spruce Run and Women Care merged into Partners for Peace. The Abused Women's Advocacy Project became Safe Voices. Family Crisis Services became Through These Doors. New Hope for Women just recently rebranded to be New Hope Mid-Coast. Caring Unlimited, bless them, have kept their name from the beginning, as has Family Violence Project and the Immigrant Resource Center of Maine. And that is the current membership of the Maine Coalition to End Domestic Violence. And just a few more words about the coalition itself. As I said, founded in 1977, we didn't have any funds specific to the coalition until 91. All the work was done by the member programs. We chipped in to create an office in Bangor and have a coordinator starting in 91. Her name was Peg Slater. But once the Violence Against Women Act passed and the Family Violence Prevention Services Act was increased, and we were able to expand the support for the coalition so that it would have a few employees. I think it was about 5. And the work of the coalition remained really to support the membership. And the membership was also the board of directors of the coalition. It was the primary point of contact with DHS, but was not responsible for administering any of the funds that went to the member programs. That was all directly contracted with DHS. Coalition was to engage in legislative advocacy and represent the interests of the whole on statewide boards, committees, and commissions. But in 2018, DHS consolidated the existing contracts for domestic violence services into one to be administered by MCEDV. It was a huge lift. In the brief time we had to prepare for that, we changed our governance structure so that we now have a community board of directors. And we needed to really engage in a time of growth to be able to have the infrastructure so that we could manage the pass-through funding, to hold all of our subrecipients accountable to all of the rules and regulations associated with the various funding streams. We created during that time a single database to try to improve the quality of data that was being captured through service delivery so that we can better plan for the work ahead. And we really want to broaden, deepen, and diversify our movement and our resources. And we need people to be able to do that. We've done a lot of work. We've created a lot of information to help inform the way that the systems in Maine work, the way advocates understand these issues. And we've published a whole bunch of those reports. You can find them on our website if you go to mcdv.org. I just put them here with their dates because all of those things are associated with changes in public policy along the way. We created an improved core advocacy program in 2018 so that all advocates in our movement across the state would have the same basic training, and that's currently being revised based on it having been used now for 4 years across the state. We're very proud of that. We also went to the legislature, and Maine really is out front in the country in supporting domestic violence intervention programs by paying for some infrastructure, by reimbursing fees for people who can't afford to attend the programs, so that we have consistent, much more consistent court ordering of offenders to participate in these programs. We're improving the quality of the programs with ongoing training and peer support, because really fundamentally we have to change what people believe and how they act, and we have to try accomplishing that from every door, every window, every opportunity. We're able to increase housing access. Generous donors helped us fund the start the Liberation Fund in 2020 during the pandemic. So we're able to do direct support for people to address some of the barriers to their safety. In 2021 alone, we were able to spend, I think it was $155,000 in direct assistance to help diminish barriers to safety that survivors were facing across the state. We have really begun foundational collaboration with Maine Transnet, helping support their data collection, and look forward to digging more deeply into what that's telling us about our services, what we need to do better and differently. And somehow, through the pandemic, we've sustained the work, we've expanded services. The Mid-Coast has more domestic violence supported housing and sheltering than it's ever had before. We were able to win economic justice relief from the legislature, debt relief, consideration of economic relief through the PFA process, and also for economic abuse to be considered when divorce provisions are being outlined. So, and we are now in a position to really expand MCEDV's training institute so that we'll be able to step up to the many opportunities we have to do more and deeper training for people like guardians ad litem, who now are required to have 3 times as much training as they were prior to the last legislative session. We're expanding our training into healthcare in a collaboration with Polly Campbell at UNE. And we're continuing the mental health training for people to obtain and maintain their licensure related to domestic violence. So we're doing lots of things. And we're informed by lots of really tremendous information. There's a lot of emerging information from the survivor-centered and culturally specific entities in the state of Maine that we are listening to and engaged with. On the national level, VAWA has funded a lot of really extraordinary work that we pay close attention to and participate in. And Global Rights for Women is where Melissa Skaya works, and she has been a really key consultant in the work we've been doing around domestic violence intervention programs. But fundamentally, to us, continuing to attend to the lived experience of the over 11,000 survivors who reach out to domestic violence resource centers across the state is our source of primary information for what we should be doing and how we should be doing it. As M. Schoenberger said in 1993, it doesn't work perfectly. We all get tired and there's not enough workers and there's too much to do. There are still pockets of resistance out there, big pockets, and bad guys still shoot their wives with guns that they have too many of in their houses. I mean, every time one of those things happens, it just enrages you all over again. And yet for people doing this work, even if I'm listening to some other woman's story, I can get another piece of closure for mine. It's a place that gets things done. It's my neighborhood. That was Connie Huntley, one of the founders at Spruce Run. So that's my story. And I will stop sharing my screen. I think I left a few minutes. Thank you all for listening to me for all that time. I hope that you have some questions or thoughts to share of your own experience of this history. I know lots of people here have their own long histories in this work.
Francine, that was just so comprehensive and lovely. Thank you so much. Yeah. And if folks too, if you don't feel comfortable sort of sharing your question out loud or unmuting yourself, feel free to message me directly, and I don't mind sort of sharing a question or comment with Francine anonymously as well. Yeah, there's just so much there, Francine. And even lately, just so many things that have been accomplished. It's pretty amazing.
Well, there's a lot. Oh, I wanted to mention, thank you, Renee popped up. Back in the 90s, one of the things that happened, of course, when we went out to Chicago in 1993, one of the things being emphasized was creating task forces. And so when we came back, we created these task forces, bringing together various disciplines around the table. And the Greater Bangor Area Task Force approached the Bangor Daily News in, I don't remember which year it was. I think it was 95. It was 95 or 96. And the editor gave us 3 days of the entire op-ed section. The Bangor Daily itself wrote some lead editorials, and we provided various members of the task force wrote op-eds, and it was really extraordinary. And the next year we had 1 whole day of it. But these are the times before the internets, people. This is when really it was about the mail, and it was about the local TV stations and the newspapers. That's what we were doing.
Those were the days, baby.
They were. And Renee was on the police beat.
I was.
That's great. Any other questions or thoughts before we close? I know Rebecca's on today too. I don't know if you had any reflections, Rebecca, listening to all of this.
It's just such a pleasure to be here and to hear this history. I have my own small part in it, but there's nothing that inspires me or makes me want to do this work more than knowing that I'm part of a movement that has made so much change and so many people working really hard. It's what keeps me going anyway. So I'm just really happy to have been here. Thank you, Francine. Thank you, Kara.
It's great. Well,